In the previous episode of this series, I said that I hadn't decided what chapter I was going to build or paint this model in. And if you're not familiar with Warhammer 40K lore, don't worry if you're not. I don't play the game either. Just like the models. Different chapters have different colors. So the Ultramarines are blue, the Blood Angels are red. The Dark Angels are dark green. The Salamanders are not quite as dark green. The Imperial Fists are yellow. So there's all sorts of colors. I was originally going to do it as an Imperial Fist because while the idea of a yellow tactical vehicle makes me chuckle, I started thinking about, well, I've done that before. I've done, Ultramarines. I've done Blood Angels. I started thinking about, I just started running through the colors in my head. And I thought I've done those. I've, weathered those and all that. And what have I not done? And a friend suggested a chapter called The Iron Warriors. And what's interesting about them from a painting and weathering perspective is all of their stuff is just a dark metallic color. They're just metal. And then their distinguishing marking are black and yellow hazard stripes, as if something like this needs hazard stripes on it to say stay away. But anyway, I thought I would do it that color because I think it's an interesting thing to examine. How do you weather a very metallic thing? How do you make metal look weathered? Now, to get started, I'm going to be using this Citadel color Iron Warriors. Ironically enough, it's their color. And I'm just going to use this dry brush, and I'm just going to go in and begin applying it like that, and just kind of take that first brush load and just spread it all over. Now, I thinned it a little with water. Now, how much water? Well, you're going to have to test that out, because the idea is you want the paint to be thin enough that it doesn't leave texture behind when it dries, but you want it to be thick enough that it pretty much gives you a good coverage in one or two coats. You don't want it so thin that it's going on more like a wash. You can see how quickly this is building up, and because of the way I've put it on, when it dries, it won't be too streaky, too textury, too brush strokey. That's the wonderful thing about metallics, is there seems to be this magical application that if you're stippling them on like this, or you dry brush them on, it's like the metal particles in the paint seem to align nicely. Whereas if you try to paint it in the traditional sense, quite often it goes pear-shaped on you real fast. So I'm just going to get the whole thing painted just like this. Now, you may ask yourself, John, why are you not airbrushing it? Well, go ahead and ask yourself. Anyway, I could airbrush this, no doubt. And it would, while this application technique is fairly quick, airbrushing, applying the paint would probably be faster. It would definitely be smoother, even though this is fairly smooth. The reason I don't is, number one, this is fun for me. You may watch this and go, I don't consider that fun. I just want to get the base painting done and move on to the other stuff, which is fine. Certainly you do it how you want to do it. But I also hear from a lot of folks, who say, well, so many people talk about airbrush this and airbrush that, and the assumption is that everyone has an airbrush. And I know from I mean, even back to my days of aircraft building. Most of the aircraft builders I knew had an airbrush, but they were very involved in the hobby, had made significant investment in the hobby. But when I talked to, folks, a larger number of people who weren't actively involved in the hobby, they maybe built one kit a year. Maybe we're just trying it out because they remember doing it as a kid, that kind of thing. They didn't want to go in for the expense of an airbrush right off the bat. And I knew many who just decided, of all the things I could spend my money on, spending, potentially several $100s on an airbrush rig and taking the time to figure out how to use it and all of those things, just wasn't their bag, man. And so I like to show this because if you have an airbrush, you can airbrush this. But if you don't, and you choose to stick to brush painting, this may be something that you go, oh, I didn't know you could do metallics that way. So maybe this is helpful. Maybe not. May just be something that an old fat YouTuber who doesn't really want to be a YouTuber, but somehow ended up doing it, gets to talk about, to waste a little time in a video. Who knows? But it's fun. That's what matters. Alright, I've got that base coat of Iron Warriors down. It's looking appropriately metallic. Now I want to do a little more. And all the steps that I'm going to be taking, it's hard to say whether you call this weathering or base painting or both, because I think often if you want a really weathered model, it starts from the primer up. Now in this case I completely covered the primer, but I'm in building this and painting this, I'm thinking about the later steps that are going to come in terms of weathering and setting the foundation. So it's sometimes when we paint and build models, we build them kind of clean, and then we get to a point where we call it finished in terms of the painting, and then we begin dirtying it up with the weathering. But I think for my own preferences, I feel like I get a better depth of finish if I start from the ground up, planning for the weathering and accounting for that at all steps along the way, if that makes sense. It's probably a bit of a over explanation, in fact, but anyway, that's the thinking for what I'm going to do with my next step. Now for my next step, I'm going to be using this Iron Hand Steel, which is a slightly lighter colored metal color, and I'm going to put it on this sponge. Now I've thinned this with some water, and I'm using a little more water than I did in the Iron Warriors, and it's not going to make a huge difference in terms of the initial overall finish. But what I'm doing is I'm just imparting a very worn look to the metal. This is essentially like I would do with chipping, but I'm being a lot heavier in my application than I normally would with chipping, because if when you're painting something that's metallic, it's very monotone. It's very one note, and it can be hard to sell the idea of scratches and damage and stuff like that. So by putting this on in this fashion, it just kind of gives some surface texture, so to speak. And by texture, I mean, in this case, I don't mean a visceral texture you can feel, but rather a visual texture. Scratches, damage, just undulations and variations in the surface itself. And I'm not looking for any particular level of it. I'm not looking for any particular, this is really, really very much what I call TLAR standard. That looks about right. You know, I'm looking for the point that for what I'm doing and for what I think it needs to be, that it looks about right. Your TLAR point may be different. You may think it needs less, you may think it needs more, and that's fine, because it's going to be different for everybody. But for what I'm trying to accomplish, I think that looks about right. So let me get this done on the rest of the model, and then we'll take the next steps. Here you can see how that looks. Just gives it a very distressed, varied surface, and just begins that, like I said, that process of laying down, essentially weathering from the very, very beginning of the process. Now the next step I'm going to take is to use some of this Vallejo game wash. It's the black wash, and you could use Citadel's Known Oil. You could use any thinned black paint, oil paints, enamels. What's the thing about this whole thing is not this product. It's what it's accomplishing. So don't get hung up on, well, I don't have that. This is just, to me, this is just thin paint. That's all that really is. I'm going to use this wide brush here. It's technically a filbert, but any wide brush will work. You could sponge this on if you wanted to. You could, put it on with a dry brush, whatever. Try different techniques, try different application methods, see how it looks. But all I'm doing is keeping the application pretty much up and down, so that if there's any tide marking or anything like that, it's going to look like streaks. But what it does is darken down the metallic areas, because I knew when I put on that lighter color of silver that it would brighten it up a bit. But to be a proper grim dark Iron Warriors or whatever, it needs to be a little darker, a little grimier. I want it to look a little grimy, a little oily, whatever. So I guess if you wanted to be fancy, you could call this a filter. I guess in a technical sense that's what it is, but to me it's just an old fat guy putting paint on a toy. So I don't take myself too seriously when it comes to stuff like this. But if you do want to apply multiple layers, let it dry, see what it looks like to you. And if you want to apply multiple layers, wait for the first one to dry before you do the second one. And it'll dry pretty quick. And if you use a hair dryer to dry it, I mean, it's literally just a few seconds away from being dry. Most of this up here is already dry now. But you could go in and you could add some extra here and there as just streaks, just to add to the character, however you want to do it. Of course, I'm going to go in later and do more weathering. The main thing that I'm watching out for is I just don't want it to pool. If it gets down in the recesses and does a little panel line shading or does a little pin washes around bolts, I'm not too worried about that. But I'm just making sure to put it on very thin so that I just get that kind of filter effect. Now on the upper surfaces, I'm going to use a stippling application like this. One, I don't want brush strokes. On the sides, it makes sense for it to look streaky, but on the top, not so much, in my mind. But also on the top is where the crew's going to walk around. It's where oil is going to get spilled. It's where, if it rains or, maybe they're on a planet with a toxic environment that rains, who knows. But I'll just stipple it on like that. And again, this is just more to darken things down, but it's taken me down the road to weathering, so I can always come back later and do this. And if you like the look of it, like I mentioned earlier, you could do that on the sides and everything like that. There's nothing that says you can only do this on the top, so it works really nicely. And if it's going on a little thick, just add a little water to it. There. It only took a few minutes, and it's darkened down a little more, looking appropriately grimy. And I like that. Probably what I'm going to do is I'm fixing to have to stop filming and go to work for the day, but I'll probably just set this aside, come back and check it later on. Alright, so far I've got it looking like a beat up metal thing, and it's definitely looking metallic, but what I want to do is I want to just bring in some metallic pop. And for this, I'm going to use Citadel's Runefang Steel, and it's just another metallic color, just a very bright silver. And what I'm going to do is just go around and dry brush around the model. I'm going to be mostly aiming for the edges, mostly. But if it gets a little, if I get a little on there like that, and it brings up the metal a little bit, that's fine, because this step is less, in my mind, is less about edge highlighting, which is often why we do, or why I do, you may do different, using dry brushing for edge highlighting. This is more about selling the notion of metal, of metallic. I mean, even if you look at this and you go, okay, that's a metal thing, the process of putting in some bright pops of metal will just sell the brain further. Because, as I've talked about, if you've watched my videos before, you probably heard me talk about my Mick Foley theory of suspended disbelief. And, we're not trying to fool somebody into thinking that this is a real thing. We're just trying to get them to temporarily agree in their mind that they will put aside their knowledge that this is a plastic toy, and will look at it with some degree of realism. Okay, my brain will accept this as a real thing. And so by doing these steps that kind of help with that, and help bring them along, we increase the enjoyment that people may get from looking at our work. And if you're the only one who looks at it, and you enjoy doing it this way, then it will increase your enjoyment of looking at your work. And if you know me, what does that contribute to? The fun. It's fun when you look at your own work and you go, yeah, I like that. If you've ever watched that movie Babe, as I say quite a few times, I like getting to the point with my models so that it's like the man said to the pig Babe at the end of the movie. He said, "That'll do, pig, that'll do." That's where I'm trying to get with my models. I can look at it and tell myself, "That'll do, pig, that'll do." Now you can see how that's looking. I think it looks like beat up metal. We're not done yet, of course. Well, let me rephrase that. I'm not done yet. You may or may not be done. But there's how that's looking. And you can go in and do the dry brushing to a greater degree if you want more pop on the edges. I could have done it before putting the black wash on, which would have toned down the edges but still left the edge highlighting there. I think this is one of those techniques that there can be little variations along the way to give some really neat visual interest to the surface. You know, for example, I could have started with the brighter color of silver, the Runefang Steel, and then stippled on some of the darkest Iron Warriors, you know, and then maybe brought in some intermediate stippling with the Iron Hands Steel color, and it would give a slightly different look. So I think this is an example of why I talk about getting your reps in is important. Just like if you're going to the gym, which I know I probably need to do sometime, get back to that. But anyway, if you build one model and you do this and you enjoy it and you have fun, that's great. But if you seek to build more models and you try out different ways of doing things, you know, if you, I talked to one guy that he said, you know, what he would sometimes do is just try one technique on the front of a model and then one technique on the back of it, and then when he decided what he liked, he would reprime the whole thing and do the technique he wanted. Whatever it takes to get the reps in. Maybe it's having a test mule model nearby, an old model that you don't use anymore that, you know, you can just try things out on and then reprime it and try it again and reprime it and try it again. The more reps you get in, the more ability you're going to have to discern what works, what doesn't, what do you like, what do you not like. What's the effect of going from light to dark or from dark to light? What's the effect of one coat of wash versus two? I mean, use the bottom of the model as a test area. You know, on something like this, I never really bother with the bottom of the model because it's just not going to be seen. But it can be a great test area. So trying different variations of this, I think will lead you to see that there's a lot that can be done with this and a lot of really cool effects, just in some metallic color, some wash, and you know, dry brush and a sponge. Now, the distinguishing mark of the Iron Warriors, aside from everything's essentially bare metal, is that they have these black and yellow hazard stripes. Just in case anybody was wondering, the giant tank with the big shooty gun on the front rumbling across the battlefield with hordes of space marines around it. Just in case anybody wondered, was there any danger involved? So, you know, they give people plenty of warning. Anyway, part of the whole deal is the hazard stripes. Now, there's several ways that I could paint those. I could just freehand it, you know, and that there's a time and place for that, and make that work. I could treat it as if the stripes, the black stripes, were painted over the bare metal, and then the yellow stripes were painted over the bare metal, so that each would, if it were chipped back, would go down to the bare metal. Now, the way I'm going to do it on the side here is I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to paint the whole, I'm going to mask off and paint the whole area with, not black, but a dark gray. And then I'm going to put in some masking and then put the yellow stripes over the black. And it's just thinking ahead to what methodology do I want to imagine that whoever painted these stripes on, did they use? You can think about that. You can not think about it. It's probably overthink, but that's part of the fun for me, is overthink. So I'm going to start off masking off just the area that I want. And what I tend to do is I tend to use features on the model to help confine it. So I'm going to make it the width of this, from this feature up and this feature up. And then I'm going to limit the bottom to being right about here, but I'm going to mask off these little squares, and then I'm going to just put a piece of tape right up here at the top edge so that it's just right in that area. So let me grab some tape and get started on that. The first thing I did is I cut a strip of some wide Tamiya tape, and I always detack the tape before I put it on the model. Even though Tamiya tape is fairly low tack anyway, it helps to detack it so that you don't have to worry about paint being pulled up. How much do I do? Well, to be honest, I just do it by sound. I don't know if you've noticed the difference. I don't know if it'll come across, but when I first started doing it, it had a certain sound to it, and I stopped when I heard a lower tack sound, if that makes any sense. Now what I'm going to do, just to save some tape, is I'm going to cut this piece in half. I'm going to lift that up, and I'm just going to define the outer edges here, and I'm just eyeballing this, nothing fancy. I'm not a fancy modeler. Trying to keep things simple. And there we go, just like that. Burnish it down pretty good right there, and let me get the other side done. Hang on. Now I'll put a piece right along here just to get that little feature. And I've still got those two little squares there, but I'm going to show you. I started to say a trick that I use. I don't know that it's a trick. It's a method. I don't think I do anything that's tricky. I'm not smart enough for tricky. So, and then I'm going to put another one. There's a kind of a edge right there where it's at an angle. I'm going to cover up that angle part so that it's just the side. Now I could extend this over across the top. I could include that angle side. I could do whatever I want. I'm just choosing for the reasons to do it that way. So let me show you how I do this. For those two little areas right there, I need a fairly straight cut. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to line my tape up on this grid here on my table and put it down there. It's not perfect, but it's close enough. And then I'm just going to cut it right along there like that. So I've got a fairly good 90-degree cut right there. And then I can just, if my old hands will keep up with me, I can put it right there. Now to get the paint on, I'm going to use a sponge. Using the sponge lets me, it lets me get a chipped appearance, which is what I'm going for. But also, because I'm dabbing it on in very light amounts, it's not going to force paint up under the tape. If I were to use a brush, I'm just going to grab this one that's sitting on my desk. If I were to use a brush and just, paint on like that, if I had too much paint on the brush, it might flow off and underneath that and create some stains and things that I don't want. But by using this, or I could go to, one of my dry brushes and dab it on there. You can use a brush like this if it's all you have. Just be sure and pull it in from the tape to the model very lightly until you form that perimeter. Certainly you could airbrush this, but with the airbrush it's a little harder to do the chipped effect. You can do it. You could put down chipping fluid and then airbrush over it, and and get great results that way. But I'm choosing to do it this way because it's fairly quick and simple. And I'm just going to take it, and I have not thinned my paint down. My paint, by the way, is Vallejo German gray. I rarely use pure black for things like this, because if I use pure black, I have nowhere to go for any kind of shadows. So I like using German gray, black gray, any color that's a near black, but not pure black. Because then, like if I put in some panel line wash up here, well, it's going to be darker. If I use a black, it's going to be darker than this paint that I'm putting down. Now, how much paint do I need to put down? Well, depends on how chipped I want it to look. You could go for barely there to 100% opacity. This is definitely one of those areas that whatever you decide in terms of your goals for the model is the right amount. So let me just do this and take a look at it up close so I can actually see what I'm looking at, and then I'll move on to the yellow stripes. All right, I've got the black on there to the degree that I want it. Now what I'm going to let it do is let it dry so that when I put the masking across it for the stripes, when I pull that back up, it doesn't lift the black up. Now I could walk away for 30 to 45 minutes, and that should be enough time to let it get dried enough that it'll be fine. Or I could hit it with a hairdryer, and that'll speed up the process. And so that's what I'm going to do. Now for the stripes, I'm going to use this narrow to media tape. I think this is 3mm. I don't remember, but it's narrower. I can't say that. Narrower. It's thinner. But and I'm just going to make the stripes this wide. That's just for convenience. Now, if I wanted the stripes to be a different width and I didn't have the tape as the correct size, what I tend to do with that, like let's say I want it to be maybe 2/3 of this width, I would lay out a strip all the way from maybe up here down here. I mean, just a long strip. And then I would take a ruler and I would hold it along that strip so that I would have a consistent width the whole way down, and then cut it. That way I would have a long strip that would all be the same width, and then I could just cut off sections from it and make sure they're all the same width. But to quote Sweet Brown, ain't nobody got time for that. So I'm just going to use this tape. Now, as before, as I talked about, I'm going to detack this tape to reduce the chance of lifting that black paint off. Now, the first stripe tends to be the one that I kind of base all the others off of. Now, I could use this 45-degree angle that's up here on my desk. This is a 30-degree angle, but there's a 45 further up. I could cut a template from that so that I would know that it was exactly 45 degrees. Yeah, that's not me. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the piece of tape, and I'm going to put it on there, and I'm going to eyeball it, and I'm going to call that close enough to 45 degrees. We'll go with, hold on, John's thinking, which is a scary thing. We'll go with that. Looks good enough to me. And so I've got that first piece of tape on there, and to define, and that's, remember, this is where there's going to be a black stripe. And let me cut me another piece of tape. And just to demonstrate the level of overthink that I often put into my modeling, I actually decided to angle it this way for a reason. I could have angled it this way, but the reason I decided to angle it this way is that seems to point like downhill, so it indicates a direction of motion this way, and I think it just lends a notion, if somebody's brain picks up on it, of it's going this way, it's moving, it's a moving object. And that's, like I said, that's probably horribly overthinking it, but for me, that's part of the fun, I guess, is to overthink some of these things. All right, now I've got that detacked. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this piece on, and I'm just going to, again, eyeball it to get it to be about the same width. Now, I made a mistake here. I should have cut this piece of tape a little longer to give me something better to hold on to, but I'll work with it. But there's a little piece up here that's going to be yellow, then there'll be yellow here. So let me just burnish that down. Now for the yellow, I'm going to use this Vallejo Game Color Gold Yellow. I like this yellow. It's a very, you can see there the color on the drop, the big drop that I put on the top of the lid. It's a very bright, punchy yellow. And if you want something yellow, this does it. It has great coverage. And it's just, it's my favorite yellow paint. But I'm going to do the same thing I did with the black. I'm blotting some off here. I'm just going to go on and start putting that on. And as with, hold on, let me autofocus this. As with the black, the correct amount is a point that I will look at and say, yep, that looks about right to me. So, you know, depends on how chipped you want it to look, how opaque, because this application method can give you a very smooth result, but you can still get 100% coverage with it. And you can always go even further. Like I could, while I've got this down, I could put an additional lighter yellowish color, like a beige or something like that, over it to appear as if it has more chipping, you know, additional chipping, faded chipping, however you want to interpret it. And it can be a little, when you're looking at it in this context, it can be a little hard to tell, okay, how intense is it? But if you take the masking up and it's more intense, then you can use washes or black paint or something like that to knock it back. And if it's not intense enough, you can just go in and touch it up with a brush. Or you can do what I usually do, which is I look at it and go, that's good enough. And I don't worry about it. All right, I'm going to declare that enough. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab these first pieces of tape that I put down. And I'm just going to use them to kind of peel back everything. And I'm just going to slowly peel it away. And see, now there's my very beat up, but definitely stripy yellow and black stripe. So it's got some of the metallic beneath it shining through. It looks worn down. And I could go in and I could do additional chipping, and I may end up doing that with some of my, I'd probably use, which one would I use? Here it is. The Iron Hands, paint called Iron Hands Steel. It's kind of between the Iron Warriors and the Runefang Steel. But I could just use that just to either sponge on. I could sponge on additional chipping over this, or I could just touch it up with a brush, which I'll probably do right here where this damage is. I'll probably go in and knock that back to a silver look, because you would think that that much damage would go all the way through the paint. So I'll probably go back and touch that up. But that's just a way of getting a pretty beat up line on there. I did one on the other side, and I made this one a little more intense so that it would just look a little different. You know, maybe like this one was older and this one had been touched up, or however you want to think about it. You know, this side obviously has more damage because you can see that damage there. Anyway, that's how you overthink stripes. Oh yeah, and this gun shield that goes on the front, I'm going to do it pretty much the same way. And here's that front gun cover. I got to admit, the whole reason I decided on this scheme was because I wanted this thing up on the front like that with those stripes on it. I just thought it looked cool. Now to base paint the tracks, I'm going to use this Citadel Steel Legion Drab. And I've thinned it about roughly 50-50 with water. And all I'm going to do is get some on this dry brush, dab off a little, and then just stipple it on. Now I've already primed this in black, so I'm going to let some of that poke through, show some shadow and stuff like that. But this is just kind of an initial, it's representing, if you've ever, you know, looked at the tracks of a tracked vehicle, whether it's a tank, or even just, a bulldozer or something like that. There tends to be a metallic look to them, but there also tends to be a rusted look, and there's, of course, dirt. So this kind of hits all of that. It's not the only color I'm going to use, of course. If you've seen my my video for the Rogel series, this is exactly the method that I used there. And if I remember, I'll try and put up a link, but if not, just do a search on the channel for Rogel. I'll just stipple this on as my first layer. Now, just in case you hadn't seen that Rogel video, I actually pre-assembled the tracks. So, and then I mark on them which side, like this one has an L, which tells me this goes on the left side. And then these that are angled, this particular one, I put RF for right front. You see, I just kind of scribed that in there so I know where they go. But this way I can have my cake and eat it too. I can put the tracks on later when I'm ready to do further weathering. Now I'm going to go back to my sponge and some German gray, and I'm just going to sponge on some of this color, and this is just going to look like chipping back to the metal color. Now you're saying, yeah, but John, German gray is not a metallic color. No, it's not. But if you look at tracks, you'll see that oftentimes the metal tends to shift to a very dark, dull look. Towards the end, I'll actually come in with some graphite and put on some of the pieces to impart some shine to it. But this is just setting up don't forget to do the inside of the tracks. And this is just setting up the stage for later weathering and dirt and mud. I mean, there's going to be all sorts of things on this track, these tracks. A lot of times I'll end up that, and the sides, I'll end up that you don't really see a lot of this because of the later mud and things like that. Because as far as that goes, I've got an idea in mind of how far I want to take it, but it may shift. So anyway, just sponge that on, and let me show you how that looks. You can see how that looks. It's nothing fancy. Nothing fancy about me. It's just a quick, easy method to do. I try to keep the things that I do. If you've watched my videos, you may have noticed that I generally tend to, especially the older I get, I tend to try and use simple products, simple techniques that anybody can do. Number one, it's easy for me to remember as I get older. Don't have to try and think, how do I do this? I know how to do some of these simple things, but I think a lot of times, I know when I watch, and I won't speak for you, but I know a lot of times, especially in years past, before I had developed some reasonable level of experience. And remember, experience, in my definition, experience is you've had plenty of time to make a lot of mistakes. That's how you gain experience. But a lot of times I would watch, I know early on when I got back into, get to the point, John, get to the point. Yeah. Early on when I was getting back into modeling, I would see all these great models and these techniques, and I didn't always understand how they were done. Now, some of them were like this. They were very simple. And once I saw how they were done, there was this moment of, oh, okay, that's all you're doing. Got it. But a lot of times there were some methods that, some things that they were really cool effects, but it took a lot of maybe specialized equipment, relatively speaking, or particular products, or and in some cases, just what I thought was inordinate amount of time, you know. And if you enjoy that, that's certainly a thing. But for me, I just like the flow. I like to just see it develop. I just like the journey. And I'm not looking for award-winning results. I'm not looking for, you know, I don't enter, like I said, I don't enter contests. The only reward I get is every now and then somebody sends me a nice note and says, thanks for what you do. And I always enjoy that. And, but it's just made me kind of decide that for my own work, I just want to keep it simple and show people what I do. And my idea being that if I were to be gone tomorrow, that my grandsons, who are right now about 5.5, in a couple of years, if somebody says, you know, your granddaddy's videos are up on YouTube, assuming somebody kept them there for me, that they could look at it and as a 7, 8, 9-year-old could be able to do all this. I figure if I can make it so they can do it, then anybody can do it. Not, I don't want to make it sound like they're not particularly bright. They're very bright, but you know what I'm saying. That if a kid can do this, if a kid having never done it can look at something like this and go, yeah, okay, I get it, and they can kind of replicate it, then I'm probably hitting the mark right. So anyway, enough of that. Got the base painting on the tracks done. Now I've been eyeballing this hose on the back here, trying to think what color do I want to paint that. And then I decided, got yellow over here, so let me just do kind of a, it's a nod to color theory, but I'm doing it kind of tongue-in-cheek, that, okay, would these Space Marines actually do things with a nod to color theory? Probably not. So it's mildly funny to me. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this Citadel contrast paint. Now, I could use some of the Vallejo Express color if I had the right color. I could use that. I could just use thinned paint. I'm just using this because contrast paints are fairly thin, and they're designed to allow whatever you put it over, whatever's underneath, to show through. So that shading between the pieces of the hose and the highlights on the ridges of the hose will just kind of show through. So it's just going to look like, think of the, you know, like a dryer vent hose. Imagine if your dryer vent hose was purple. Then that's what this is. You could leave it silver. I could, well, you can do whatever you want. I could leave it silver. I could paint it red. I could paint it blue. I could paint it gray. I could do whatever I want. But like I said, I'm just choosing to be kind of silly and paint it purple, because who knows? While Space Marines may be tough warriors, they may also care about color theory. There's a few more little details that I may paint off camera, but nothing other than, you know, just continuing the stuff that I've already done, just on all the little parts yet to be glued on. And some of the stuff I'll save until towards the end after the weathering, like painting the various lenses and things like that. I tend to leave those towards the end after the weathering, because if I paint them now, I'll just get weathering all over them. So the weathering is going to be the next video in this series. So I'll call this done, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turning out so far. I love this. I love the stripes. I mean, I just love the ridiculousness of, you've got this big, you know, I mean, because a Space Marine is, you know, maybe this tall. So, I mean, this is a big tank, you know, and so you've got this thing coming along. It's going to have this giant gun sticking out the front. And, you know, hazard stripes. Stay away. It might be dangerous. Oh, thank you. Maybe it's just me. But anyway, I'm going to call this video done. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate that. And hey, I tell you what, let's have a little fun. If you're still hanging around here at the end, why don't you drop a comment down below that just says Bad news bees. Bad news bees. If you know your old Saturday Night Live lore, you'll know what that is. You'll know the stripes. Even if you don't know what that is, people will look at that comment and go, what the heck are they talking about? So we'll just have a little fun that way. So anyway, again, thank you for watching. And as I always say, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. And have fun with your modeling. Don't worry about what everybody else says. Don't worry about the social medias. Just have fun with it. Have fun with it. And learn everything you can, test everything you can, try everything you can, because I always believe that the more you know about the hobby, the better equipped you are to do the things that you want to do, and the better you can do the things you want to do, the more fun you have. So anyway, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.